Let me tell you what this video is not. It is not a manipulation guide. It is not a collection of dark psychology tricks for getting people to do things against their own interests. It is not the kind of content that treats other human beings as targets to be worked rather than people to be engaged with genuinely. What it is an honest examination of what the social psychology research actually says about effective influence, about the specific strategies that the science of persuasion, communication, and human motivation consistently identifies as producing the outcomes people want. In negotiations, in relationships, in professional contexts, in every arena where what you want requires the willing participation of other people. And here is what that research keeps finding. The most effective strategies are not manipulative. They are not tricks. They are not techniques that work by bypassing the other person's rational agency or exploiting their psychological vulnerabilities. They are strategies rooted in a genuine understanding of how human beings actually make decisions, what actually motivates them, and what actually produces the experience of being heard, understood, and genuinely met, which is the psychological condition under which people are most naturally inclined to give you what you are asking for. That is what we are examining today. The first strategy is the one the research identifies as the single most underused tool in the entire influence literature. Asking better questions, not rhetorical questions, not leading questions designed to funnel someone toward a predetermined conclusion. Genuine, open, curious questions that invite the other person to think rather than defend. That signal authentic interest in their perspective, that create the psychological experience of being genuinely heard before being asked for anything. Edgar Schein's research on humble inquiry, the practice of asking questions to which you genuinely do not know the answer, identifies this as one of the most powerful tools in human communication precisely because of how rare it is. Most people in conversations where they want something are waiting to speak rather than genuinely listening. The person who is actually curious, whose questions come from genuine interest rather than strategic positioning, produces a response in the other person that no amount of persuasive argument can replicate. The experience of being genuinely curious about is one of the most powerful experiences in human social interaction. It activates the affiliative system. It produces warmth and openness. It creates the psychological safety under which people naturally become more generous, more forthcoming, more inclined to engage with what you subsequently bring to the conversation. Ask better questions first. Everything else works better after. The second strategy is one that the negotiation research identifies as the most consistent differentiator between effective and ineffective influencers. Anchoring deliberately. The psychological research on anchoring, first documented by Tversky and Kahneman and subsequently replicated across thousands of studies in negotiation, pricing, evaluation, and decision-making contexts, finds that the first number, the first position, the first concrete proposal introduced in any negotiation or decision context has a disproportionate and lasting influence on the final outcome. The anchor does not have to be accepted. It does not even have to be taken seriously as an initial position. But once it is in the room, it shapes the reference point against which all subsequent positions are evaluated. The final outcome will almost always be closer to the anchor than to any position that was not stated first. The practical application is straightforward. In any context where you are asking for something that involves a number, a salary, a price, a deadline, a quantity, the person who names a figure first and names it deliberately rather than reactively has a structural advantage that the research consistently documents. The strategy is not to anchor outrageously. The research on anchoring and counteroffers finds that implausible anchors produce backlash rather than the desired gravitational pull. The strategy is to anchor at the high end of what is genuinely justifiable and to have the reasoning prepared that makes it feel legitimate rather than aggressive. The third strategy is the one that the research on persuasion consistently identifies as the most counterintuitive and the most powerful. Acknowledging the strongest version of the other side before presenting your own. The research on two-sided arguments, studies by Mike Allen and colleagues on the comparative persuasive power of one-sided versus two-sided messages, consistently finds that arguments that acknowledge the strongest counterarguments before presenting their own position are more persuasive than arguments that present only one side. Not because people are persuaded by weakness, because people are persuaded by credibility. And credibility, the research finds, is produced more reliably by demonstrating that you have genuinely considered and can articulate the opposing position than by any amount of confident assertion of your own. The person who says, "I understand why you would see it this way, and here is what that position gets right," before making their own case, has done something psychologically significant. They have demonstrated to the other person that they are safe to engage with, that this is not a one-sided interaction where their perspective will be dismissed without consideration. That genuine dialogue is possible, and genuine dialogue is the condition under which minds change. Not argument, not evidence delivered in the absence of acknowledgement. Genuine dialogue. Here is the fourth strategy, and the one that the clinical research on motivation identifies as the most consistently misunderstood: connecting to intrinsic motivation rather than applying external pressure. Edward Dekai and Richard Ryan's self-determination theory, one of the most robust and extensively tested frameworks in the psychology of motivation, identifies a fundamental distinction between extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation that is directly relevant to every situation where you want someone to do something. Extrinsic motivation, the carrot and the stick, the reward and the punishment, the external pressure and incentive, produces compliance. Behavior change in the specific context where the external pressure is applied. It is not ineffective, but it has a critical limitation. It stops working when the external pressure is removed. Intrinsic motivation, the connection of the desired behavior to the person's own values, goals, and sense of who they are, produces something qualitatively different. It produces ownership, the experience of choosing rather than being pressured, of doing something because it aligns with something that is genuinely theirs, rather than because an external force is compelling it. The strategy is not to manufacture intrinsic motivation that is not there. It is to identify, through the genuine questioning that the first strategy supports, what the other person actually cares about, what matters to them, what they are working toward, and to connect what you are asking for to what they already want, genuinely, not manipulatively, finding the real connection rather than performing one. When someone experiences what you are asking for as aligned with their own goals rather than as a demand made on them, the entire dynamic of the interaction changes. The fifth strategy is the one that the negotiation and conflict resolution research identifies as the most reliably effective in high-stakes interactions. Naming the dynamic explicitly. Chris Voss, whose work on negotiation draws on decades of FBI hostage negotiation experience and the psychological research underlying it, identifies what he calls labeling as one of the most powerful tools in any influence context. The explicit naming of what is happening emotionally and dynamically in an interaction. It seems like this feels unfair to you. It sounds like there is something about this proposal that does not sit right. It looks like we are stuck on something that might be worth naming directly. The psychological mechanism is related to the affect labeling research conducted by Matthew Lieberman at UCLA. The finding that naming an emotional state reduces its neurological intensity, that the act of putting words to what is happening emotionally produces a measurable reduction in amygdala activation and a corresponding increase in prefrontal engagement. The person who names the dynamic, who says out loud what is happening in the room, does several things simultaneously. They demonstrate that they are paying attention. They reduce the emotional intensity of the interaction by surfacing what was previously implicit. And they create an opening for genuine engagement with the actual obstacle rather than the performance of the obstacle. Named dynamics can be addressed. Unnamed dynamics run the interaction from underneath. Here is the sixth strategy, and the one most consistently overlooked in conversations about influence: being willing to walk away and communicating that willingness genuinely. The research on negotiation leverage and the foundational concept of BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, developed by Roger Fisher and William Ury in their landmark work on principled negotiation, identifies the willingness to walk away as the single most important determinant of negotiating power. Not the performance of willingness to walk away, The actual willingness, the genuine alternative that makes the current negotiation desirable but not necessary. Because the psychology of influence is not symmetrical. The person who needs the outcome more than the other person has structurally less influence, regardless of the quality of their arguments, the strength of their position, or the sophistication of their strategy. Need communicates. It communicates through the quality of attention, through the degree of accommodation, through the subtle but readable signs that the interaction is producing anxiety rather than equanimity. Genuine alternatives, developed before the negotiation begins, not manufactured within it, produce genuine equanimity. The equanimity that reads as confidence, that produces in the other person the experience of interacting with someone who does not need them, and the research on attraction in both social and professional contexts is consistent. We want more what we cannot simply have. We take seriously the person who is clearly prepared to be fine without us. Build your alternatives before you need them. They will do more for your influence than any in-the-moment strategy can. The seventh strategy is one that the social psychology research identifies as one of the most powerful and one of the most ethically straightforward tools in the influence literature: consistency commitment. Robert Cialdini's foundational research on the psychology of influence identifies commitment and consistency as one of the 6 core principles of persuasion. The human drive to behave consistently with prior commitments, with what we have said, with what we have publicly agreed to, with the positions we have taken, is one of the most reliable motivational forces in social psychology. The strategic application is specific. Before asking for what you want, secure a small, genuine commitment that is directionally aligned with the larger ask. Not a manipulative foot-in-the-door technique, a genuine, meaningful, smaller commitment that the person can authentically make, and that, once made, creates a psychological orientation toward consistency with the larger direction. The research finds that the commitment is most powerful when it is active rather than passive, public rather than private, and effortful rather than easy. The person who has written something down, said something aloud in the presence of others, or worked toward something, has a significantly stronger psychological pull toward consistency with that commitment than the person who simply nodded agreement. The strategy is to create the genuine small commitment first, to ask for the yes on the thing that is unambiguously yesable before bringing the larger ask. Not to trick, to create the genuine psychological momentum that consistency motivation generates. Here is the 8th strategy, and the one that ties every other strategy together: patience as a deliberate practice. The research on decision-making under time pressure and the broader literature on cognitive load and its effect on the quality of decisions is consistent on a finding that most people intuitively know and systematically ignore. Decisions made under time pressure are worse decisions, not occasionally, consistently. The sense of urgency that time pressure produces activates the same threat response that narrows attentional focus and depletes the executive resources that careful, considered decision-making requires. The person who wants something and wants it now, who communicates that urgency, who applies time pressure, who creates the experience of scarcity and immediacy, is activating in the other person exactly the psychological state that produces the most defensive, most reactive, least generous response available to them. The person who has genuine patience, who communicates through their manner and their timeline that they are prepared to allow this to develop at the pace it needs, produces the opposite. The relaxed, unhurried quality of an interaction with someone who is not pressuring produces the psychological conditions most associated with generosity, with creative problem-solving, with the willingness to find solutions that work for both parties. Patience is not passivity. It is the active management of the pace of influence in ways that the research consistently shows produce better outcomes than urgency. Not because slow is always better than fast, because the other person's best response to what you are asking for almost always comes from a state of ease rather than a state of pressure. Give people room. The research consistently finds they fill it in your favor. Here is what I want you to take from this. Every one of these 8 strategies shares a common foundation that the research keeps returning to, regardless of the specific context of influence being examined. They work not by bypassing the other person's agency, but by engaging it genuinely. not by exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, but by creating the psychological conditions under which people naturally want to engage, to find solutions, to give generously. The genuine question that treats the other person as worth understanding. The anchor that is legitimately justified. The acknowledgement of the other side that demonstrates credibility. The intrinsic motivation that connects to what they genuinely care about. The naming of the dynamic that creates safety for genuine dialogue. The genuine alternative that produces genuine equanimity. The real commitment that creates genuine momentum. The patience that creates genuine room. These are not tricks. They are the application of what the research on human psychology consistently finds about the conditions under which people are most naturally generous, most naturally open, most naturally inclined to give you what you are legitimately asking for. Not every time, nothing works every time, but consistently, reliably, with a track record in the research that the shortcut approaches, the manipulation, the pressure, the exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities do not come close to matching, because the research on long-term influence outcomes is unambiguous. The strategies that respect the other person's agency produce better outcomes. Not just better outcomes for them, better outcomes for you, every time.